The sun rises over the labyrinth of São Paulo's favelas, its golden rays piercing through the tangled web of electrical wires hanging like veins over the city. A young boy, barefoot and hollow-eyed, steps outside, his feet pressing against the cracked pavement of a world that swallows the weak. Charles Oliveira knew hunger before he knew victory, felt the weight of despair before he lifted gold. His mother, hands calloused from labor, prayed in whispers, hoping her son would escape a fate that had already claimed so many. Gunshots echoed in the distance, a cruel reminder that death was always watching. The streets offered no mercy, and the only escape was through iron will or bloodshed. At 7, a doctor told him he might never walk again. Rheumatic fever gnawed at his body, a silent predator within. But Oliveira was no prey. He defied fate, ignored the pain, and stepped into a jiu-jitsu academy where survival was earned through sweat and sacrifice. His first lessons weren't just techniques, they were weapons, a language of war for a boy fighting destiny itself. Every chokehold he mastered was another chain broken, every victory a rebellion against the life that tried to keep him caged. The kids around him played to escape. Oliveira trained to conquer. By 12, he was a champion, his name whispered through the alleys of São Paulo like an urban legend. The slums weren't just where he came from. They were the fire that forged him. But battle scars don't fade easily. Even as he rose, they whispered, "Quitter." A word spat at him every time he fell. They saw his stumbles, his defeats, but they never saw the man sharpening his fangs in the dark. And one day, the world would witness the storm that was coming. Steel doors clanged shut behind him as he stepped into the unforgiving world of mixed martial arts. This was no playground. This was a battlefield where only the ruthless survived. At 18 years old, Charles Oliveira entered the cage for the first time, his opponent seeing a lanky Brazilian kid, unaware they were staring at a beast in the making. He didn't just win, he annihilated. 12 straight victories, 11 finishes, a storm tearing through Brazil's regional circuits. Dana White took notice. The UFC beckoned, and at 20, Oliveira made his debut against Darren Elkins. The world barely had time to blink. 41 seconds. That's all it took. A lightning-quick armbar, a submission so precise it felt like destiny itself had guided his hands. The arena erupted, and a new name was carved into the sport's unforgiving history books. But the UFC wasn't just a league, it was a graveyard for the unprepared. His meteoric rise was met with violent lessons. Jim Miller humbled him. Cowboy Cerrone crushed him. Paul Felder broke him. The whispers grew louder. He's weak. He folds under pressure. Each loss was a knife in his back, reopening old wounds from the slums where failure meant starvation. But Charles Oliveira was not just another name to be forgotten. His losses weren't tombstones. They were battle scars, carved deep into the flesh of a man who refused to kneel. Doubt was his enemy. Resilience was his weapon. He was about to embark on a path no one saw coming, a resurrection so violent it would leave the world in awe. He stared into the mirror, fists clenched, eyes burning with the weight of failure. The reflection didn't show a champion. It showed a man drowning, a fighter labeled as a quitter. Every loss replayed in his mind like a tormenting ghost. He wasn't like the others. He didn't have million-dollar contracts, private jets, or safety net. He had one option: fight or be forgotten. The world had turned its back on him. His own countrymen mocked him. Brazil, the land of warriors, had cast him aside. And so, he disappeared, vanished from the spotlight, retreating into the shadows like a wounded beast. But what the world failed to understand was that shadows weren't his grave. They were his birthplace. Inside the dimly lit walls of a new training camp, Oliveira sharpened his weapons, evolving into something monstrous. His once wild striking became surgical. His jiu-jitsu, already lethal, turned into a death sentence for anyone who dared grapple with him. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was preparing for war. The losing streak, the doubts, the insults, each one was fuel. The man who would return was not the same man who left. The world was about to witness something terrifying. The resurrection of Charles Oliveira had begun. The cage door locked. The crowd roared, but Oliveira heard nothing, only the pounding of his own heart. He had returned from the abyss, but this was his trial by fire. The UFC was no place for redemption stories, only executions. Across from him stood Clay Guida, a relentless, grizzled veteran. They said Guida was too tough, too experienced, a storm that would drown the quitter. The bell rang. Oliveira struck first. His hands were sharper, his eyes colder. He moved with a confidence that sent a shiver through the arena. Guida shot for a takedown. Mistake. Like a predator pouncing on its prey, Oliveira wrapped his arms around Guida's neck. The guillotine choke was so deep, so vicious that even the wild Guida had no escape. Tap. The doubters blinked in disbelief. It had begun. Fight after fight, Oliveira cut through the division like a blade. Giagos, Tamer, Lentz, Gordon. Each name fell like another brick in the wall of his revenge. He had been buried, forgotten, mocked. Now he was a storm tearing through everything in his path. But he was still seen as an outsider, a man climbing a ladder that the world swore he would fall from. He didn't care, because he wasn't climbing. He was coming to burn the whole thing down. The whispers turned to silence. The doubters, once loud, were now hesitant, watching in disbelief as Charles Oliveira refused to break. But there was one final test before the world would take him seriously. Kevin Lee, a powerhouse, a wrestler, knees, elbows, takedowns, reversals, a war unfolding in real time. But Oliveira had no plans to drown. The second round came, and Lee began to fade. Oliveira's pressure was suffocating. The Brazilian smiled, stalking him, sensing the inevitable. Then in the third, Lee made a fatal error. He shot for a takedown. Oliveira, like a coiled viper, snapped up his neck. The guillotine choke was flawless, a technique forged from years of suffering. Lee tapped, but then tried to fake it, eyes filled with desperation. It didn't matter. The ref had seen enough. It was over. The world had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Charles Oliveira was no longer a story of failure. He was a story of inevitability, and he was only getting started. The gates of hell opened, and inside stood Tony Ferguson, a man built from nightmares, a relentless machine who had never been broken. They called him El Cucuy, the boogeyman of the lightweight division. Fighters feared him. His wars left opponents shattered, their bodies wrecked beyond repair. And now the UFC had fed Charles Oliveira to the monster. The world watched, expecting another execution. They didn't realize the predator had changed. The bell rang, and Oliveira moved like a ghost, slipping past Ferguson's wild strikes, controlling the cage with an eerie calm. Then in an instant, he struck, a perfectly timed takedown. Boom! Ferguson hit the mat, and Oliveira descended like a storm. His grappling wasn't just technical, it was merciless. He folded Ferguson like a corpse, trapping him in an armbar so deep the crowd gasped. The arm snapped back. A normal man would have screamed, tapped, begged for mercy. But Ferguson, he refused. The round ended, his arm mangled, ruined, lifeless. But Oliveira didn't celebrate, because the war wasn't over. Rounds 2 and 3 were a demolition. Oliveira ragdolled the former champion, his control absolute, his dominance unquestionable. Ferguson fought like a rabid animal, but there was no escape. By the final bell, the message was clear. El Cucuy had been broken. Oliveira stood over him, breathing heavy, eyes burning with something the world hadn't seen before. Not just hunger, destiny. The division felt it. A storm was coming, and the championship was next. The division was shifting. Khabib Nurmagomedov was gone. The lightweight throne stood empty, and the UFC needed a king. But kings aren't given crowns, they take them. And Charles Oliveira was coming to take everything. But first there was one last gatekeeper, a man forged in Bellator's trenches, a wrecking ball with knockout power. Michael Chandler, a walking storm, built to break men early. The UFC had lined him up as the next big thing, the new face of destruction. Oliveira was an afterthought, a stepping stone. They were wrong. The fight began like an explosion. Chandler blitzed forward, a caged animal on the hunt. A right hand detonated. Oliveira staggered, barely standing. The arena erupted. This was it. The moment he would fold, just like before. Chandler pounced, hammering down brutal ground and pound. The ref circled closer. The commentators were ready to call it, but Oliveira refused to die. The bell saved him, but he didn't need saving. He had survived worse. As round 2 started, he rose from the stool with murder in his eyes. And then, boom, a left hook, fast and lethal. Chandler's legs buckled. The crowd gasped. Another left hook. The wrecking machine was now the wreckage. Oliveira swarmed, unloading vicious shots. Chandler collapsed. The ref dove in. It was over. Charles Oliveira had done the impossible. A man the world had written off was now the UFC lightweight champion. No more doubts. No more whispers. No more past failures. The favela had won. The world had no choice but to respect him now. Charles Oliveira was the UFC lightweight champion. But being a king is one thing. Keeping the throne is war. The division's deadliest wolves were circling, eager to rip the belt from his hands. And the first challenger? Dustin the Diamond Poirier. A man who had walked through fire, a veteran who had dismantled Conor McGregor twice, and the fighter many believed was the uncrowned king. The night of UFC 269 arrived, and the odds were stacked against Oliveira. Again. The critics swore Poirier was too powerful, too battle-tested. They called Oliveira a paper champion, a man standing on a throne built from luck. But they had forgotten something. Luck had never saved him. Pain had built him. The fight began with violence. Poirier came out swinging, his fists like cannon fire. Boom! A right hand smashed Oliveira's skull. He staggered, barely holding his ground. The arena held its breath. Was this the end? Was this the moment the champion broke? Number Oliveira didn't retreat. He charged forward. Knees, elbows. A brutal clinch war erupted. Poirier landed another nuclear shot, but Oliveira ate it like it was nothing. Round 1 ended with the challenger ahead. Then in round 2, Oliveira did what he did best. He drowned Poirier in deep waters. The Brazilian dragged him to the canvas, smothering him with suffocating top control, dropping elbows like sledgehammers. Crack, crack, crack. Blood painted the mat. The round ended with Poirier exhausted, gasping for air. And in round 3, Oliveira ended the war. Like a phantom, he slipped onto Poirier's back. His arms tightened. His grip was unbreakable. Rear naked choke, deep. Poirier's hands clawed at Oliveira's arms, but it was over. He tapped. The belt stayed in Brazil. The king had defended his throne. The world could doubt no longer. Charles Oliveira was not just a champion. He was a force of nature. But even greater danger was coming. The wolves weren't finished yet. The world had seen him rise. They had seen him break men who were supposed to break him. But one thing still remained. The most violent challenge of his life. A man built for destruction. A human wrecking ball with fists like hammers. Justin Gaethje. Gaethje wasn't just a fighter. He was chaos personified. A brawler who turned every octagon into a battlefield. A man who had taken Tony Ferguson's soul. A warrior who had forced Khabib into retirement. And now he wanted Oliveira's head. The critics swore that this time, the belt would change hands. Gaethje was too aggressive, too powerful. But Oliveira didn't care. The fight began in pure insanity. Gaethje, like a berserker, stormed forward, throwing bombs with reckless abandon. Boom! A right hook connected. Oliveira's head snapped back. Another shot. He fell. The crowd erupted. The champion was on the ground. But Gaethje had made a mistake. Oliveira wasn't hurt. He was setting a trap. As Gaethje hesitated to follow him to the mat, the Brazilian rose like a demon, his face covered in blood, his eyes burning with fury. Then in the blink of an eye, revenge. Oliveira uncorked a missile of a right hand. It landed flush. Gaethje stumbled. Boom! Another shot. The hunter had become the hunted. Gaethje dropped, and that's when Oliveira ended it. Like a snake striking, he wrapped around Gaethje's neck. The choke was in, tight, suffocating. Gaethje, a man who never quit, had no choice. His hands flailed. His body went stiff. He tapped. Another war. Another victim. The belt was staying with the king. But just as Oliveira stood on top of the world, fate had one final trick left to play. A betrayal not by a man, but by the scales. The greatest robbery in UFC history was about to unfold. The war with Gaethje was over. The blood had dried, the belt was his. But the UFC had other plans. A champion is supposed to be defeated in the cage, not on the scales. But on the night before UFC 274, Charles Oliveira stepped onto the scale, and the world shifted against him. The number blinked back, 155.5. Half a pound over the lightweight limit, half a pound. A margin so small it should have meant nothing, but it meant everything. Confusion spread like wildfire. Fighters from overseas swore the scales had been tampered with, recalibrated without warning. Oliveira's team protested, but the ruling was final. He was no longer champion. It didn't matter that he had the most dominant streak in lightweight history. It didn't matter that he had slaughtered Poirier and Gaethje back-to-back. The UFC took his belt without him ever losing a fight. The first champion in history to be stripped of his title for half a pound. But champions aren't made of gold. They're made of fire. Oliveira didn't beg. He didn't complain. He made a promise. The champion has a name. His name is Charles Oliveira. The belt might have been taken, but the war was far from over. The UFC had created something they didn't understand. A Charles Oliveira with nothing left to lose. And now he was coming for his crown. There was only one man standing in his way, Islam Makhachev, a new monster, a new battle, a new war that would shake the lightweight division to its core. The road back to the throne led straight into the jaws of a monster, Islam Makhachev, the heir to Khabib's legacy, a man built from the same Dagestani steel, trained by an undefeated king, molded in the cold and merciless mountains. The UFC had already crowned him in their minds. Oliveira was just a formality. They called it a mismatch. They said Oliveira had no answer for Makhachev's relentless wrestling, his suffocating pressure. The odds were stacked against him, again. But Charles Oliveira had never cared about odds. UFC 280, the night of reckoning. The world watched, breathless, as the two warriors stood across from each other. Oliveira, eyes sharp, body carved from war. Makhachev, a silent storm, ready to drown him. The bell rang, and the battle began. Makhachev came forward with precision, his footwork flawless, his strategy clear. Take Oliveira down, break his will. The Brazilian stood his ground, striking with calculated aggression, forcing the Dagestani to respect his power. Then came the moment. Makhachev shot for a takedown. Oliveira sprawled, tried to resist, but the grip was like iron. Boom! He hit the canvas. The world held its breath. For years, Oliveira had used the ground as his kingdom. His submissions were legendary. But Makhachev was different. He wasn't just controlling Oliveira. He was dominating him. Elbows rained down, every movement suffocating, every second draining the life from the Brazilian. Round 2. Makhachev struck first. A crushing left hand sent Oliveira stumbling. Boom! A follow-up shot. Oliveira collapsed. The cage shook as the Dagestani pounced, wrapping around his neck in a vice grip. The world froze. Tap. The war was over. The impossible had happened. Charles Oliveira had fallen. The division had a new king. The doubters roared back to life. The Cinderella story was over, or so they thought. Because warriors like Oliveira don't disappear. They rise. And this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something even greater. The world thought it was over. They saw Charles Oliveira fall and believed the story had ended. But leviathans don't drown. They rise from the abyss. He had lost before. He had been mocked, broken, left behind. But every time he returned stronger, deadlier, hungrier. This time would be no different. Makhachev had taken his belt, but he had not taken his soul. And that meant Oliveira was still dangerous. He didn't disappear. He didn't wallow. He went back to war. The UFC offered him another top contender, a name designed to push him back into obscurity. Beneil Dariush, a cold, calculated fighter, riding an 8-fight win streak, an elite grappler, a striker with knockout power. The UFC was setting up a new challenger for Makhachev, and Oliveira was supposed to be his stepping stone. But Oliveira was no man's stepping stone. He was the storm that washed them away. The fight began. Dariush came forward, cautious. testing the waters. But Oliveira wasn't waiting. He had something to prove. Boom! A right hand cracked through Darius's defense. The crowd gasped. The Brazilian was moving faster, sharper, deadlier. Then came the moment of truth. A takedown. Darius, an elite grappler, dragged Oliveira to the mat, expecting to control him. Mistake. Oliveira was already moving, attacking, hunting. The reversal came like a lightning strike. In seconds, Oliveira was on top. Elbows rained down, vicious, merciless. Darius tried to escape. Too late. Oliveira smelled blood, launching a final, brutal assault. TKO. The fight was over. He had silenced the doubters. Again. The crowd erupted. The message was clear. He wasn't done. Makhachev had taken his belt, but Oliveira had just made his next statement. He was coming back for his crown. The rematch was inevitable. The war was unfinished. The leviathan was awake. The world had tried to bury him, but they had forgotten one thing. Charles Oliveira was not a man who stayed buried. The victory over Benil Darius wasn't just a win, it was a warning. He rise again and again until the world itself kneels. And Charles Oliveira was not finished yet. The world had crowned him, but Charles Oliveira knew the truth. A king is only as strong as his next war. The battlefield was shifting, new threats emerging from every corner of the lightweight division. Poirier, Gaethje, Sarukian, Chandler. The list of challengers stretched into the horizon, but deep down, Oliveira wanted one thing. Khabib. The undefeated Dagestani had walked away at the peak of his reign, his record untarnished, his dominance unquestioned. But now his legacy stood in the shadow of Oliveira's fire. The Brazilian had crushed Makhachev, shattered the very foundation of Khabib's empire, and the world knew. There was only one way to settle this. The whispers grew louder. Will Khabib return? The legend had sworn on his father's grave that he would never fight again. But could he watch from the sidelines as Oliveira ruled the kingdom he once commanded? Could he sit in silence while the UFC called the Brazilian the greatest lightweight of all time? The world held its breath. Oliveira waited, his hands still wrapped, his body still aching from war, his eyes still locked on the next battlefield. He had climbed from the slums of São Paulo to the very peak of the fight game. But he knew this journey had no end, because leviathans don't stop. They don't rest. They don't fade into history. They only conquer. And Charles Oliveira was ready for whatever came next. The war was never truly over, but Charles Oliveira had already carved his name into eternity. From the favelas to the throne, from forgotten to feared, from doubted to undeniable. His story was no longer just about a fighter. It was a testament to the unbreakable will of a man who had every reason to fall, but never did. The lightweight division had been a graveyard for dreams, a place where warriors came to be broken. Oliveira had been thrown into its depths, buried alive, mocked as a quitter. But he didn't just survive, he conquered. He tore through legends, silenced doubters, and turned the sport's most unforgiving division into his personal kingdom. Even in victory, the battlefield called. Another challenger, another war, another night where the world would hold its breath. This was the life of a leviathan. It didn't matter who came next. It didn't matter what the UFC, the critics, or the analysts predicted, because Charles Oliveira had rewritten fate before, and he would do it again. He walked out of the cage one more time, his face carved with battle scars, his belt glistening under the arena lights. The roar of the crowd faded behind him. He had proven everything, conquered everything, endured everything. And yet, as he stepped into the darkness of the tunnel, one thought remained. There is always one more war. The cage would call again. And when it did, the Leviathan would rise once more.